The man who wiped Henry VIII's bottom was one of England's most powerful nobles. This wasn't punishment. Lords competed for the job. They got rich, gained influence, and heard state secrets. But what they witnessed inside the king's chambers during his final days was so disturbing, every record was destroyed. Imagine competing for a job where your primary duty is wiping another man's backside. Now imagine that job makes you one of the most powerful people in the kingdom. This was the reality of the Groom of the Stool in Tudor England, a position so bizarre it sounds like a medieval joke, yet it was deadly serious. The title itself, Groom of the Stool, referred to the close stool, an elaborate portable toilet that accompanied the king everywhere he went. But this wasn't some lowly servant position handed to the desperate or the destitute. These were high-ranking noblemen, educated and wealthy, who actively sought this role. They understood something that might seem insane to us today. In the twisted hierarchy of royal courts, the person who handled the king's most private moments held more influence than generals who commanded armies. The year is 1509, and young Henry VIII has just ascended to the throne at 18 years old. Athletic, charismatic, and hungry for glory, he needs someone he can trust completely. Not just to manage his wardrobe or serve his meals, but to attend to the one activity where even kings are utterly vulnerable. The man chosen for this honor doesn't recoil in disgust. He accepts with pride, knowing that what seems like the ultimate humiliation is actually the ultimate opportunity. Because in the brutal game of Tudor politics, proximity to power was power itself, and no one got closer to the king than the man who literally wiped his bottom. The Groom of the Stool existed for over 400 years, from 1495 until 1901, spanning centuries of British royal history. This wasn't some brief medieval oddity that disappeared with the Dark Ages. Queen Victoria's court still had an official Groom of the Stool, though by then the duties had become purely ceremonial. But during Henry VIII's reign, there was nothing ceremonial about it. The position was created by Henry VII, the king's father, who understood that the most dangerous threats came from within, from advisors who smiled to your face while plotting your downfall. He needed someone who would see him at his most human, most vulnerable, and remain absolutely loyal. The solution was brilliant in its perversity. Create a position of such intimate access that only the most trusted noble could fill it, then reward that person so lavishly they would never betray you. The groom received a salary that dwarfed what military commanders earned, along with estates, titles, and direct access to royal funds. They didn't just wipe the king's bottom and leave. They dressed him, undressed him, monitored his health, kept detailed records of his bowel movements, and stayed within shouting distance at all times. They slept in a private chamber adjacent to the king's bedroom, closer than his own wife. They were the first person the king saw each morning and the last at night. This constant presence meant they overheard conversations, witnessed private meetings, and absorbed state secrets that could topple governments. But here's what made the position truly powerful. The Groom of the Stool controlled access to the king's privy chamber, the private rooms where real decisions were made. Anyone who wanted to speak to the king privately had to go through this man first. Ambassadors, nobles, even the queen herself needed his permission to enter. He decided who got 5 minutes of the king's time and who waited for hours. He could whisper advice directly into the royal ear with no witnesses, plant ideas, warn against enemies, and manipulate decisions. The courtiers who spent fortunes on elaborate clothing and grand gestures to catch the king's attention were wasting their time. The real power broker was the man who saw Henry VIII sitting on a velvet-covered toilet box, vulnerable and human. And Henry VIII, unlike his father, needed this position more than anyone could have anticipated. Because what started as political strategy would become medical necessity, as the king's body began its long, disgusting descent into decay. But before we get to the truly horrifying details of what the groom witnessed during Henry's final years, you need to understand just how intimate and disturbing these duties actually were on a daily basis. Let's talk about what the Groom of the Stool actually did, because the reality makes the job title sound almost pleasant by comparison. Every morning began the same way. The groom would enter the king's bedchamber before anyone else, sometimes while Henry was still sleeping. He carried fresh linen, rose water, and whatever medieval hygiene supplies passed for cleanliness in the 16th century. Spoiler alert, they weren't good. Toilet paper didn't exist, so the groom used fine linen cloths to wipe the king clean after he relieved himself. These weren't rough rags either. We're talking about expensive fabric, sometimes embroidered, because even the cloth that touched the royal bottom had to reflect the king's status. After wiping, the groom would inspect what the king had produced. This sounds comically disgusting, but it was actually primitive medical diagnostics. The color, consistency, frequency, and smell of the king's waste told them everything about his health. Dark, hard stools meant constipation, possibly from too much rich food or not enough exercise. Loose, frequent bowel movements suggested illness or poison, a very real concern when half the court wanted you dead. Blood in the stool could indicate internal injuries or disease. The groom kept detailed written records of every bathroom visit, creating what was essentially a medical journal of the king's digestive system. The closed stool itself was a masterpiece of uncomfortable luxury. Picture a wooden box, roughly the size of a modern ottoman, upholstered in velvet or leather and often trimmed with gold. Inside was a pewter or ceramic bowl that collected the waste. The lid was padded for comfort because even though you're defecating into a box, you're still a king and deserve cushioning. Some closed stools were elaborately carved with royal emblems, angels, or even religious imagery, which raises disturbing questions about the Tudor sense of humor. The king didn't go to the bathroom came to the king. The closed stool traveled with Henry everywhere he went, to hunting lodges, to military campaigns, to diplomatic meetings at other palaces. There were probably multiple closed stools, strategically positioned around each royal residence so the king was never more than a few rooms away from relief. And the groom had to manage all of them, ensuring they were clean, fresh, and ready at a moment's notice. Imagine being at a state dinner, diplomatic negotiations hanging in the balance, when suddenly the king stands up and walks out. Everyone freezes, wondering if they've offended him, if war is about to be declared, if heads are about to roll. Meanwhile, the groom of the stool is calmly following him to a private chamber, helping him drop his elaborate Tudor pants, and waiting patiently while the King of England takes a royal dump. Then wiping him clean, examining the results, making notes, and helping him dress again. All in complete silence because discussing what just happened would be unseemly. The medical monitoring went far beyond just looking at waste. The groom tracked everything: what Henry ate, how much he drank, how well he slept, his energy levels, his moods, his sexual activity. Yes, that too. When the king spent the night with his wife or a mistress, the groom knew about it. When Henry struggled with performance issues in his later years, a topic that caused him immense shame and rage, the groom was the only person he could discuss it with. This created a relationship that went far beyond servant and master. It was more like a confession booth, except instead of sins, you were confessing your bowel movements. And the groom couldn't just be disgusted or squeamish. He had to act like examining the king's feces was the most normal, dignified thing in the world. One wrong facial expression, one hint of revulsion, and you could lose your head. Literally. Henry VIII wasn't known for his patience with people who disrespected him. The groom had to master the art of looking at something genuinely revolting and reacting with professional detachment, like a doctor examining a wound. Except doctors don't usually live in constant proximity to their patients, sharing intimate spaces and hearing every private thought. The psychological toll of this job must have been staggering. You're one of the most powerful men in England, with estates and titles and wealth, but you achieve it by handling another man's excrement and pretending it's an honor. So who were these men willing to do this? They weren't desperate commoners grateful for any job. They were members of the nobility, educated at the finest institutions, related to powerful families, with everything to lose if they fell from favor. Sir Henry Norris, one of Henry VIII's most trusted grooms, was a wealthy landowner, a knight, and a member of the Privy Council. He had options. He could have pursued military glory, diplomatic posts, or comfortable retirement on his estates. Instead, he chose to spend years wiping the king's bottom, and it made him fabulously wealthy and politically influential. Sir Anthony Denny, another groom, became so powerful that he controlled access to the king during Henry's final years, essentially running the government from the shadows. He decided which documents Henry saw, which advisors got audiences, and which policies moved forward, all because he was willing to handle the king's most intimate functions. These men understood that medieval court life was a brutal competition, where everyone wanted the king's attention and favor. Nobles spent fortunes on clothing, threw lavish banquets, funded military campaigns, and built monuments, all hoping the king would notice them and grant some favor. But the groom of the stool didn't have to compete. He already had something no amount of money or grand gestures could buy: guaranteed private time with the most powerful man in England, every single day with no one else present. The position also came with incredible perks beyond just political influence. The groom received a massive salary, often over £500 per year, which in Tudor times was an astronomical sum. For context, a skilled craftsman might earn £10 per year. The groom was making 50 times that just for bathroom duty. But the real wealth came from grants of land, estates confiscated from fallen nobles or dissolved monasteries, given to the groom as rewards for faithful service. These estates generated income, provided housing, and could be passed down to children, creating dynasties of wealth. The groom also received allowances for clothing, food, servants, and expenses, essentially living at royal cost. They had private apartments in every royal palace, rooms that were larger and better furnished than what most nobles could afford. They dined on the same food as the king, wore clothing almost as elaborate, and traveled in the royal entourage, treated with the respect due to someone of high rank. From the outside, no one would guess that this wealthy, powerful nobleman spent part of his day wiping the king's backside. They only saw the results, the influence, the wealth, the access. And that was exactly how the grooms wanted it. The actual duties were kept private, discussed only in the most discreet terms, while the power and prestige were displayed publicly. But the prestige came with a price that had nothing to do with dignity and everything to do with danger. Because the groom of the stool knew things that could destroy kingdoms, and that made them incredibly valuable and incredibly vulnerable at the same time. Think about it from a strategic perspective. If you were a foreign power trying to gather intelligence on England, who would you target? The king himself? Impossible to access. His ministers? Surrounded by guards and layers of bureaucracy. But the groom of the stool, the man who sees the king at his most vulnerable, who hears private conversations, who knows about secret illnesses or weaknesses, that's your target. Numerous attempts were made to bribe, blackmail, or turn the groom into a spy. Foreign ambassadors offered fortunes for information about the king's health, his moods, his plans. Rival nobles tried to plant their own servants in the groom's household, hoping to gather scraps of information. The groom had to be paranoid at all times, trusting no one because one mistake could mean execution for treason. And execution in Tudor England wasn't a quick affair. We're talking about being hanged, drawn, and quartered, one of the most brutal death penalties ever devised. You were hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still alive, then beheaded, and finally your body was cut into quarters and displayed around the kingdom as a warning. That was the penalty for betraying the king's trust. Sir Henry Norris learned this lesson the hard way. Despite years of faithful service, despite his wealth and influence, despite being one of Henry VIII's closest friends, he was arrested in 1536 on charges of adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn. The charges were almost certainly false, manufactured by Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell to eliminate rivals and justify Anne's execution. But here's the thing, true or not, the charges worked because Norris had access. He was always around the Queen, always in private chambers, always present at intimate moments. It was plausible that he could have had an affair, and plausibility was enough. Norris was tortured, tried, and executed. His head displayed on London Bridge as a warning to anyone who thought their position made them untouchable. His estates were confiscated, his family disgraced, and his name erased from official records. Years of wiping the king's bottom, years of loyal service meant nothing when Henry decided you were a threat. This wasn't an isolated incident. Multiple grooms of the stool fell from favor and lost everything, sometimes their lives because they knew too much or became inconvenient. The position was a high-stakes gamble. Play it right and you become fabulously wealthy and powerful. Make one mistake and you die screaming. Every groom understood this calculation and accepted it, driven by ambition, greed, or the simple human desire to be important, to matter, to be the person the king turns to in his most private moments. The secrets the grooms knew went far beyond political gossip or palace intrigue. They witnessed the king's psychological state, his paranoia, his mood swings, his private fears and obsessions. Henry VIII was a complicated man, charismatic and terrifying in equal measure, and the grooms saw both sides. They saw him weep over dead children, rage at ministers who disappointed him, obsess over religious minutiae, and spiral into paranoid delusions about assassination plots. In his later years, as his body deteriorated and pain became constant, Henry's mental state grew increasingly unstable. He would wake in the night screaming about demons and witches, convinced that his enemies were using black magic against him. He accused servants of poisoning his food, even though food tasters had already tested everything. He saw conspiracies everywhere, plots within plots, everyone a potential traitor. The groom of the stool was the only person who witnessed these episodes in full, and they had to decide, do you report this to the Privy Council, letting them know the king is mentally unstable? Or do you keep it secret, maintaining the fiction that Henry is still the strong, decisive monarch England needs? Nice. Either choice was dangerous. Report it and you might be accused of slander or treason. Keep it secret and you're complicit in hiding the king's diminished capacity, which could be seen as treason too. The groom walked a constant tightrope, managing not just Henry's physical care but his public image, ensuring that England never realized their king was falling apart. And fall apart he did, in ways that made the normal duties of the Groom of the Stool seem pleasant by comparison. Because starting in 1536, after that fateful jousting accident, Henry VIII's body began a slow, horrifying descent into decay that would test every groom who served him. The leg wound that refused to heal, the infection that spread and festered, the ulcers that wept constantly, all of it fell under the groom's purview. This wasn't just about wiping the king's bottom anymore. It was about managing a rotting, diseased body that smelled like death and leaked fluids that soaked through bandages in minutes. The physicians handled the medical treatments, applying poultices and cauterizing wounds, but it was the groom who dealt with the daily reality. Changing soiled bedding, disposing of waste that wasn't just fecal but included pus, blood, and tissue from the infected leg. Helping move a king who weighed over 400 pounds and could barely walk without screaming in agony. Pretending not to notice the smell, a putrid combination of rotting flesh, sweat, and human waste that permeated everything. Servants drew lots to determine who would enter the king's chambers, and the losers often emerged pale and shaking. But the groom didn't have that luxury. This was his job, day after day, year after year, watching Henry VIII slowly die from the inside out. And that's when the really disturbing discoveries began. By 1544, the Groom of the Stool at the time witnessed something that would haunt him forever, something the official records tried desperately to hide. During a routine bandage change, as he unwrapped the soiled cloth from Henry's ulcerated leg, he saw movement. Not the pulse of blood or muscle twitching, but something else entirely. Pale, segmented forms, writhing through the exposed flesh like fingers searching for something deeper. The groom froze, his training in court etiquette warring with the primal human instinct to run screaming from the room. He'd been warned, of course. The physicians had mentioned complications, unusual aspects of the king's condition that required discretion. But nothing prepares you for seeing parasites living inside another human being, especially when that human is the King of England. The creatures, dozens of them, had made a home in the necrotic tissue that lined the wound like a cathedral. They burrowed through muscle and sinew, creating tunnels that wept yellowish discharge no amount of honey or wine could staunch. Some were several inches long, translucent white with darker segments visible through their skin, and they moved with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. The groom managed to keep his composure, a testament to years of training, but his hands shook as he rewrapped the wound. He said nothing to the king, who was mercifully asleep, sedated with opium, but later, in a private meeting with the chief physician, he asked the question everyone was thinking, but no one dared voice. What are those things? The physicians didn't have a good answer, which was somehow more terrifying than any diagnosis could have been. Some argued they were common maggots, the kind that spontaneously generate in rotting meat according to medical wisdom of the time. But others disagreed vehemently. The movement was wrong, too deliberate, too organized. These things weren't just feeding on dead tissue, they were actively burrowing deeper, creating structures almost like they were building something. Dr. Rodrigo, a Spanish physician, suggested they might be parasitic worms contracted during one of Henry's military campaigns in France, where soldiers often returned with strange afflictions. But that theory didn't explain how they'd survived for years without killing their host, or why they seemed to be multiplying. Whatever they were, they'd been living inside the king for months, possibly years, and no one had noticed until a servant happened to unwrap the bandages at just the right angle in just the right light. The discovery sent shockwaves through the inner circle of the royal household. A secret meeting was convened, attended only by the most trusted physicians and the current Groom of the Stool, in a locked chamber far from prying ears. They debated furiously. Were these creatures natural or supernatural? Divine punishment for Henry's break with Rome? Biological weapons introduced by foreign enemies? Or simply an unfortunate medical condition that looked more sinister than it actually was? The Groom of the Stool found himself at the center of an elaborate conspiracy of silence. Dr. Butts, the king's chief physician, made it abundantly clear that what they'd witnessed was now a state secret, protected by treason laws. Anyone who spoke of it would be executed, their families stripped of titles and property, their names erased from history. The groom understood perfectly. If word got out that the King of England was being consumed from the inside by parasites, it would be catastrophic. Foreign powers would sense weakness, rebellions would ignite across the kingdom, and the very stability of England would collapse. So he kept the secret, even as the duties became increasingly horrific. He watched the creatures multiply, the wound expand, the king's body slowly hollowed out from within. He helped change bandages that were soaked with not just pus, but living things, writhing and squirming. He disposed of linen cloths that crawled with pale forms, burning them in braziers to ensure no one else saw. He listened to Henry scream at night about feeling things moving under his skin, about insects crawling through his veins, and he knew those weren't just opium-induced hallucinations. The king was literally being eaten alive, and the groom of the stool had to pretend everything was fine, that this was just another medical complication, nothing to worry about. The psychological toll must have been immense. How do you maintain sanity when your job involves daily exposure to something that defies rational explanation? The conspiracy deepened as more people witnessed the infestation. Servants who'd seen anything unusual were transferred to distant estates, or in some cases, simply disappeared. Their absences explained away with vague stories about family emergencies or sudden illnesses. The king's chambers were declared off-limits except to a select few, and even they were sworn to secrecy under pain of death. New treatments were attempted, each more desperate than the last, and the groom had to implement many of them. They packed the wound with crushed pearls, believing the gemstones possessed purifying properties, a task that fell to the groom since the physicians couldn't be there constantly. They applied poultices made from boiled toad skins and mercury, remedies that only added to Henry's agony. And again, the groom was the one applying them during late-night emergencies when the pain became unbearable. He became part physician, part confessor, part conspirator, managing the king's decay while maintaining the elaborate fiction that Henry was still the vigorous monarch England needed. The weight of these secrets affected every groom who served during those final years. Some became withdrawn, haunted by what they'd witnessed. Others threw themselves into work, perhaps hoping that focusing on the practical aspects would keep them from thinking too deeply about the implications. One groom, whose name was expunged from records, apparently suffered a complete breakdown, found wandering the palace corridors at night, muttering about worms and demons. He was quietly removed from service and sent to a monastery, where he lived out his days in isolation, taking the secrets to his grave. By 1546, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything the groom could have imagined. Henry VIII couldn't leave his bed except when lifted by teams of servants into a specially designed chair. And even that process was agonizing for everyone involved. The smell had become so overpowering that the groom wore cloths soaked in perfume, tied around his face, and even that barely helped. The wound on Henry's left leg had opened to such a size that you could supposedly fit a man's fist inside it, and the creatures within had multiplied beyond counting. Physicians who examined him reported that the entire lower third of his leg was now essentially hollow, a shell of skin containing nothing but corruption and parasites. But the worst part wasn't the physical horror. It was watching Henry's mind disintegrate alongside his body. The king who had once debated theology with Erasmus, who'd composed music and written poetry, who'd charmed ambassadors and intimidated rivals, was now reduced to a confused, frightened old man who couldn't remember where he was or who his attendants were. He would call the groom by names of men long dead, confuse present events with memories from decades ago, and sometimes just weep uncontrollably without explanation. The groom had to maintain composure through all of it, responding calmly to the king's confusion, redirecting his attention when he became agitated, and somehow maintaining the dignity of the office even as everything fell apart. The final months brought horrors that went beyond the medical and into the realm of the truly bizarre. Multiple attendants, including the groom, reported hearing sounds emanating from Henry's wounds, described as scratching, rustling, or in some accounts, something almost like whispers or wet breathing. One night, the groom was changing bandages when he swore he saw the skin around the ulcer moving in waves, as if something beneath was trying to push its way out. He documented this in his private journal, one of the few written records that survived the purges, and his handwriting reveals his terror. The letters are shaky, some words scratched out and rewritten, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was recording. He wrote that the creatures seemed to be organizing themselves, creating structures within the cavity of Henry's leg, almost like a nest. Some physicians speculated they were preparing to metamorphose, to transform into whatever adult form they possessed, which raised the terrifying question: what would happen when they matured? Would they emerge from the king's body? Would they spread to others? The groom had to manage these fears while continuing his duties, and the stress was visible. Courtiers noted that he'd aged dramatically in just a few months, his hair going gray, his face gaunt. He rarely slept, keeping watch over the dying king, perhaps afraid of what might happen if he left Henry alone even for a moment. When Henry VIII finally died on January 27, 1547, the groom of the stool was there, one of only a handful of people present at the exact moment. The king's final hours were agonizing, seizures racking his enormous body for hours as his wounds erupted with discharge so copious it soaked through the bedding and pooled on the floor. The groom stayed by his side, holding his hand, offering what comfort he could to a man who'd been both his employer and, in a strange way, his charge. When the end came, just before dawn, Henry's last coherent words were directed at the groom. According to the sealed testimony that survived, Henry whispered something about feeling them inside him, about seeing through their eyes, about losing track of where he ended, and they began. Then he was gone, and the groom had to step back and allow the embalmers to do their work. But even death didn't end the horror. The embalmers discovered that the wounds were still active hours after Henry died, still seeping fluid. And within that fluid were hundreds of the pale creatures, now seemingly frantic, crawling across Henry's cold skin, as if searching for a way to escape their dying host. The chief embalmer, Richard Ferris, later testified that he'd never seen anything like it. They had to sweep up the creatures and burn them in a brazier, a process that filled the chamber with acrid smoke, and a smell that made grown men vomit. The groom's final duty to Henry VIII was perhaps the most important, ensuring the secret stayed buried. He worked closely with the embalmers, the physicians, and the Privy Council to coordinate the cover-up. Henry's body was sealed in a massive lead coffin within hours of death, the lid welded shut with such thoroughness that it would require industrial tools to ever open again. All medical records were collected and burned, including the groom's personal journals, though some fragments survived through copies made by others. Servants who'd witnessed anything unusual were paid off or threatened into silence. The official story was that Henry died of natural causes related to his obesity and infected leg, which was technically true, just incomplete. The full truth, the parasites, the psychological breakdown, the bizarre phenomena surrounding his final days, was locked away in sealed testimonies that wouldn't be opened for centuries. The groom himself was rewarded for his service with additional estates and a generous pension, enough to ensure a comfortable retirement. But those who knew him said he was never the same after Henry's death. He became reclusive, avoiding court life, spending his final years on a remote estate where he rarely spoke about his time in royal service. When he died, his personal effects included a locked chest that his family was instructed never to open. Centuries later, when it was finally pried open by historians, it contained nothing but ashes, suggesting he'd burned whatever final records or memoirs he'd kept. So why would anyone want this job? Why would educated, wealthy noblemen compete for a position that involved so much degradation and danger? The answer reveals something fundamental about power and human nature. The groom of the stool existed in a unique space in the royal hierarchy, simultaneously servant and confidant, nobody and somebody, degraded and exalted. They understood that real power isn't about public displays of authority or impressive titles. It's about access, about being in the room when decisions are made, about having the ear of the person who matters most. Every other noble at court had to fight for the king's attention, competing with hundreds of others for brief moments of favor. But the groom had hours every day, private hours where the king let down his guard and spoke freely. That access was worth any amount of personal indignity. There's also a psychological element. Becoming the groom of the stool required accepting complete subservience to the king, acknowledging that his needs, no matter how degrading to fulfill, were more important than your dignity. In a perverse way, this created an intense bond between the two men. The king knew the groom had seen him at his absolute worst and stayed loyal anyway. That created trust that couldn't be earned through grand gestures or military victories. The position also reveals how power structures require intimacy and vulnerability. Kings weren't just rulers. They were human beings with bodies that failed, minds that wavered, and fears they couldn't show publicly. The groom of the stool served as a buffer between the public image of the monarch and the private reality. They maintained the fiction of royal supremacy while managing the messy truth of human frailty. This wasn't unique to England either. Similar positions existed in other European courts, and even in ancient civilizations. The Roman emperors had cubiculari, chamber servants who performed similar functions. The French kings had their own versions, though they used different titles. The Chinese imperial court had eunuchs who served intimate functions for emperors. Across cultures and centuries, rulers needed someone who could handle their most private moments, and those someones often became incredibly powerful. The pattern is consistent. Proximity to power trumps dignity, access beats prestige, and the person who sees you vulnerable controls more than the person who sees you strong. The Groom of the Stool was the ultimate expression of this principle, taking it to an extreme that seems almost absurd until you understand the game being played. The position was officially abolished in 1901, though it had become increasingly ceremonial throughout the 19th century. By the Victorian era, modern plumbing and changing attitudes about privacy had made the actual duties obsolete. The title lingered as an honorary position, granted to high-ranking nobles who never actually performed the original functions. Queen Victoria's Groom of the Stool never wiped anyone's bottom. He managed her household and served as a senior administrator. But the core principle survived in different forms. Today we have chiefs of staff, personal assistants, and bodymen who serve similar functions for powerful people. They don't handle bathroom duties, but they do control access, manage private moments, and hear secrets that could destroy careers. The President of the United States has a bodyman who's with him almost constantly, handling everything from keeping his schedule to fetching his reading glasses. That person wields enormous informal power because they're always there, always listening, always part of the conversation. Celebrities have personal assistants who manage their lives so completely that they know things the celebrity's own family doesn't know. Business executives have executive assistants who control who gets meetings and who doesn't, essentially serving as gatekeepers to power. These modern equivalents don't face the same degrading physical duties the original Groom of the Stool endured, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Be indispensable to someone powerful, and you become powerful by proxy. Henry VIII's Groom of the Stool literally wiped a tyrant's bottom while helping rule an empire. A contradiction so absurd it seems impossible until you remember that history is full of such contradictions. Power doesn't follow logical rules. It flows to whoever can get closest to the source, regardless of how degrading the path might be. Those noblemen who fought for the privilege of handling royal excrement understood something we often forget. Dignity is subjective, but power is real. They chose power, and in doing so, they shaped history in ways most nobles could only dream about. They whispered advice that led to wars, influenced marriages that changed dynasties, and protected secrets that could have toppled kingdoms. All because they were willing to do what no one else would do. In the end, the story of the Groom of the Stool is a reminder that even the most powerful rulers are still human, still vulnerable, still dependent on others for their most basic needs. And the people who meet those needs often end up controlling far more than anyone realizes. So the next time you think about power and how to get it, remember, sometimes the fastest route to the top isn't the most obvious or dignified path. Sometimes it's the one everyone else is too proud to take. If you've made it this far, you clearly appreciate history that's too strange and disturbing to make it into textbooks. Hit that subscribe button because we're digging up more bizarre truths that schools won't teach you. Drop a comment telling us which historical figure's weird secrets you want exposed next. Your suggestions literally shape what we research. And smash that like button to help YouTube show this to more people who need to know that the man who wiped Henry VIII's bottom was actually one of the most powerful people in England. Because real history isn't about crowns and glory. Sometimes it's about who's willing to do the dirty work that keeps empires running.